Hello, I'm Pat Quinn, the managing partner of Cadwalader, and I'm excited to welcome you to the first in a new series of leadership conversations hosted by Cadwalader partner Mark Grider. Mark leads our firm's crisis management and congressional investigations practice. And for this first conversation, he has invited some other leaders and colleagues in the space to join him. Mark managed congressional investigations in the House and US Senate, as well as during his time on the White House legal staff. And in his nearly 20 years of experience in government, he has cultivated relationships on Capitol Hill and at the federal agencies that have certainly helped clients navigate choppy waters. In addition to Mark's legal expertise, he has also been a leader in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is extremely high on my and our firm's list of priorities. So we are doubly blessed to have Mark with us as a partner at Cadwalader. With that, I'll turn it over to Mark to introduce his guests.
Thank you for that introduction, Pat. It's an honor to be here, having served almost 20 years in the government as an AUSA and on both sides of the aisle. It's an honor to be able to sit here and have a great panel join me to talk about congressional investigations and crisis management. Before we get started, I just want to once again thank three groups. One is my colleagues in the Global Litigation Group, White Collar Group, and the Crisis Management and Congressional Investigations Group. I want to thank my colleagues here and friends that I've known for years that are here today, that took time out of their schedule to talk about these different various issues. And more importantly, I want to thank you, the clients and the people tuning in that we serve. And service is sort of the way I approach private practice, is that we're looking to serve our clients. And talking about service, a good friend of mine sort of talked to me in terms of crisis management about sort of what I like to call the CCA method in dealing with crisis management. Number one, which we'll talk about, is showing concern. When something comes in and hits your desk, you have to take it seriously, which you'll hear a little bit more about, and show that concern. Number two is cooperating, showing a level of cooperation, which we'll talk a little about in terms of privilege and those types of issues. And the last is taking action, which sort of falls into what I'd like to call more of the compliance bucket, which we'll talk a little bit about that. And so today we're excited that you've tuned in. We're excited to talk about these various issues, and we look forward to even receiving comments back from you. So without further ado, once again, it's an honor that you all are taking time out of your schedules, and I'm going to allow my friend, starting off with Susanne, to introduce herself. Susanne?
Thanks. My name is Susanne Sachsman Grooms. I'm a partner at Kaplan, Hecker & Fink, where I serve clients with crisis management and a variety of government investigations, and with a specialty in congressional investigations. I started my career as a prosecutor in the Department of Justice in the tax division, and spent about 10 years leading teams of lawyers doing congressional investigations in the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, and where I had a great seat at that table for the significant investigations of the last decade, including most recently being able to serve on two impeachment trial teams, and of course being the counterpart to Mark and Phil on the Select Committee on Benghazi.
Yeah, my name is Phil Kiko, and I started out my career initially as a legislative director for a member of Congress, Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner, who just retired after 42 years. I served as his chief of staff and legislative director. I served as the staff director and general counsel of the House Judiciary Committee. I was the deputy staff director when he was chairman of the Science Committee. And more recently, I had been the staff director of the Benghazi Committee with Mark and Susanne for Chairman Gowdy. And then up until a few months ago, I was the Chief Administrative Officer of the House, which is an elected position under both Speaker Pelosi and Speaker Ryan. So I just wanted to say also I've had experience, lots of oversight experience, but I've also had oversight experience, particularly at two cabinets, Department of Education and Department of Interior, where I was on the other end of trying to figure out and trying to respond to oversight requests. And so I'm sort of in a good position, I think, to add some relevance to this team. Thank you.
And I'm Charlie Broll, and for this group we have law firms and we have congressional staff covered. I'm the business side of this. I most recently was the general counsel of Nestle Waters up in Connecticut, and before that was with another food and beverage company, Diageo. But actually this is full circle for me because I started my career as a young legislative aide for a junior senator from Delaware who now has a different address on Pennsylvania Avenue these days. But happy to be here, and thanks for having me.
Well, Susanne, Phil, and Charlie, really appreciate you being here. We're going to go through some questions that we've heard from clients, but we hope to make this a lively discussion, and we look forward to getting started. And so, Susanne, I'm going to turn to you, and the first question is, just from the basic standpoint, what is congressional oversight, and why should boards and CEOs and general counsels really care about it?
Sure. So just last week, the House Oversight Committee and the House Energy and Commerce Committee issued a letter launching an investigation to a major drug company, and that had just put out and gotten accelerated FDA approval on a major new drug. And that is a critical letter that asks for a significant amount of very sensitive documents related to that new drug. The investigation is following up on some news reports about concerns with the FDA's process for the approval and also concerns about the pricing of the drugs, which is something that both of those committees have been really interested in for years. And I tell you that because it's a great example of congressional oversight and specifically how it can impact and the risk that it can create for a company. If you can imagine, the company already had bad news stories from the FDA's sort of stories that instigated the congressional investigation. The congressional investigation itself put out a bunch of press releases about the investigation, so it had another round of those stories. The investigation itself is going to be a risk. There'll be an involvement of turning over documents. Those will be sensitive documents. The sensitive documents will be out in the world. Often that happens during congressional investigations. And that's a risk in terms of competitors. It's a risk in terms of other ongoing civil litigation, related or unrelated. And then, of course, there's the risk of any action by Congress or release of documents causing the FDA to kind of reconsider or to consider its decision, which is a major risk for that company. So when thinking about that, and that's sort of why we're here today, to walk you through what do you do when Congress comes knocking, I have sort of three thoughts to think about. The first one is who you need to figure out who you're dealing with and what it is they want. And this is an area where people make like the biggest mistake, and one of the areas where I think it's most helpful to have an expert to sort of help you navigate. Because not every place in Congress is the same. There are hundreds of members of Congress. All of them can write you a letter. There are a number of committees in Congress that do congressional investigations. Each one of them abides by slightly different sets of rules, and more importantly, really different sets of practices and traditions that are almost always unwritten. And so it helps to have somebody who's been in the space and understands how those different committees work to help you navigate through that process and to help you understand who you're dealing with and really what it is that you're facing. And then step two is developing and determining what's going to be success for your company. And you need to think about that in light of who it is that's looking at you, sort of the first analysis. So success, if you had a member of Congress without subpoena power and not in a major congressional committee sending you a letter, might be getting out of that investigation altogether. But that's not going to be the case with the letter that I just described from the House Oversight Committee and Energy and Commerce Committee, where both of those chairs do traditionally strong investigations, have unilateral subpoena authority and are going to follow up and insist on getting those documents and be working towards having a hearing, probably a hearing with your executives. So in those instances, you're thinking, what's success there? It's something more like limiting the amount of documents you're turning over, ensuring that the documents that you're turning over, attempting that the documents you're turning over will prevent your sensitive documents that you care the most about from being published on the internet, and trying to prevent your CEO from testifying, trying to avoid a subpoena, which, as you know, boards are not going to be looking at favorably. So, and then the third step is developing a plan and then implementing that plan to reach your goal. And so once again, it helps to have somebody who's a trusted person in Congress, because of course these are all repeat players and the Congressional Investigations bar is not that large, to help you navigate through those relationships, because again, very few really strict and direct rules that you're dealing with. So there's a lot of room for negotiation. So it helps to have somebody who understands the factors you're negotiating with and the people that you're negotiating with.
Now, just to jump in, I think that's an important, your first point is important for those of us who operated in-house. We would have regular interactions with members of Congress and their staff on all sorts of policy and legislative issues. But knowing the time when that contact comes and knowing that this is different and this is an investigation versus this is a typical legislative or policy ask, can be confusing depending on the committee. Now, House Oversight, it's very easy to know you're in an investigation. But if it's coming from the Banking Committee or from some other committee or some subset of that or some members, you might not know at the outset. And so it's key to make sure that if you allow your internal staff, both the lawyers and the GA staff, to have that direct interaction with members, that they need to be aware that just to know when to reach out to a law firm that does this kind of work to say, wait a minute, I think this is something more than just congressional policy making going on here.
I just want to add one more thing to that. I have seen the situations, particularly with law firms sometimes, where they get a congressional investigation and they want the former prosecutors to handle the congressional investigation. And my view is it should be a team effort. You should have somebody with that kind of background as part of the team, but you need to have somebody that has had some experience on Capitol Hill with investigations also be part of the team, because they don't understand the nuances that you just mentioned.
Yeah, no, that's right, Phil. And I think the other piece in terms of sort of the internal investigation, we were talking about building rapport. Usually when you get that, and we're going to turn to the second point, is just doing a quick internal, gathering the documents, figuring out what happened internally. So I think those can be done in parallel, but I think, Charlie, we experienced doing that quick internal investigation and trying to understand what actually is taking place. Phil, I'm going to turn to you. I believe we came up with this title. When the phone rings, what should you do? How does Congress normally get in touch with you? And I know we use the telephone. Not sure why, because most of our cell phones, and there's many different ways we get in touch. But Phil, I just wanted you to talk about that in terms of how does Congress reach out?
Well, I think there's two facets to how Congress reaches out. One is a less formal way, and one is a more formal way. And I would say the less formal way is how does your organization become aware that you're going to be subject to a congressional investigation? And it could be a press release. It could be Twitter. It could be the member makes some kind of reference to some investigation at a town hall meeting back in the district, or relative to some constituent or something, or we need to look into that, and it could be private sector or it could be governmental. It could be at a press conference, a press release, Facebook posts, the members being interviewed, those kind of things. They've had this in the back of their mind, or maybe a decision has already been made that there's going to be an investigation, but nobody knows about it. So if that ever comes across your desk, you should start the planning process just so you're ready. But then, After that, then that's the more formal process. You're either going to get a phone call from a chief of staff or a committee counsel on an investigation is going to occur, or some oversight is going to occur, and so be ready. Or you're going to, that process may be bypassed, where you're going to get a letter from the chair of the committee or a letter from the chair and the ranking member of the committee. And basically it could be just a letter of inquiry to get everybody ready for what's coming. It could be a more formal letter with a document request, which will then get the process started about what does that mean and how are you going to try to educate, how are you going to try to narrow down what that document request is, because it could be tens of thousands of pages of documents, which really doesn't help either side. It's just a waste of time, and nobody, congressional staffs are not unlimited resources. So I would just say that that's pretty much how you do it. Now, sometimes you can get letters of inquiry or just a letter from a member of Congress. You should take it seriously. Sometimes there's ways in the rules under committees and stuff in the House for minority members to have, they can send letters too, but it's really what really matters here is the chair of the committee. But you need to take every request from a member or minority, whatever, seriously, because it could turn into something bigger. And if you can head it off at the pass at a lower level, then it doesn't get elevated. So that's all I have. Does that make sense?
And I can share in my instance that the investigation that occurred at one of the businesses I represented was by tweet, that we found out about it. A letter had been sent, but it hadn't arrived yet. And so, the very foremost question of what is this about, we couldn't even answer, because all we knew was a member had tweeted that they had launched an investigation against our business. We had no other information. We had to scramble very quickly because the word was out. Now, that's an area that is, though, similar to today's litigation context. There are many plaintiffs' firms that launch a press release or something on social media about a litigation that they have started, and you don't have any of the papers yet. And so that you can draw some similarities in that instance for your communications team to say, look, we're going to have to put out a very brief holding statement that we've just become aware of this, that we're learning the facts. We'll dig into this. But it's still very unsettling how quick of the pace the world is these days, that you're finding out something as serious as this on social media rather than through normal means.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I found a little confusing when I started in Congress a couple of years ago, many moons ago, maybe is a more appropriate way of saying that, is that Congress doesn't start out with a subpoena, and it's actually incredibly easy, I think, to avoid getting one, because nobody wants to get to that place. And that's a little different than obviously a criminal investigation when you're in a grand jury and you just sort of get a subpoena right out the gate. And so, you'll get something that is a letter. It is a letter asking for documents. It's a letter asking for information. Sometimes it's asking you to answer questions. Sometimes it's asking you to come in for a briefing. But whatever it is, it's a letter that is the equivalent of Congress's sort of first step. And then depending on whether it's a committee chair with subpoena authority, et cetera, you want to do a really detailed analysis on how you want to respond to that. But again, it is a place where if getting a subpoena is something that your company wants to avoid doing, you can. You just have to understand, again, who you're dealing with and then how to negotiate out of that.
I mean, from the perspective of the subpoena, it's almost recognizes there's been a failure in the negotiation process, which sometimes is where people want to be, but mostly it does not, because the subpoenas can really drag things out forever, because then you're getting into fights over documents. Sometimes you can go to court over this kind of stuff, and it drags the process out way too long.
No, that's good. Charlie, I'm really glad you're here. And really able to give us a perspective of what boards general counsels and CEOs think. And so can you take us through sort of some of the issues that when a GC or government affairs executive receives that inquiry? What are some of the issues like privilege, scope, crisis communication? Can you walk us through what you've seen and what other GCs may be experiencing?
Sure. First thing at the outset, it's all going to happen on a very condensed timeline comparatively to litigations that can go for years. So you've got to be organized quickly. But what the board's going to want to know is, what's the scope of this investigation? What's the timing? What's the process? And that's where you get into questions of things like, does privilege apply here? Is it like a litigation or is it not? And, I'm no expert in this area. I read the Mazars case, and there's some nice dicta that actually happened after our investigation. But, what I would say is, there's probably privilege, but you can't really rely on it. Congress's scope, investigatory powers are so broad that it's hard to really rely on it. And lastly, what the board is going to want to know is who's the team. And the team can't just be lawyers, and it can't just be, as Phil mentioned, prosecutors or people who defend, good at litigation defense. You need a broad team, and that broad team needs to include not only your government affairs staff and your communication staff and the legal staff, but also a law firm who knows this space. And it's really even from that first communication with congressional staff. So, as I mentioned earlier, we were informed via Twitter. We reached out to staff only to say, we need a copy of the letter that we haven't received. We didn't make any other commitments, and we said we will be back in touch when we have a law firm on board who you may have a relationship with. You may have worked with them on previous matters, and so those were the key things that from a board perspective and CEO perspective that they wanted to know. What's the timing, what's the scope, what's the timing, what's the process, and who's the team? And so within 24 hours, we were moving very quickly on all those fronts, and having the law firm help us to explain to our board and to our CEO, here is the scope, here is the timing, here is the process, and then having them as part of the team was really key in our instance.
Real quick, in terms of one word that I use when working with general counsels is sort of cadence. As you're interacting with the staff and maybe getting the documents, any recommendations that when you've worked with outside counsel of sort of the cadence and sort of scoping and the timing of how things work? What do you appreciate in terms of that updates?
In the early stages, it was fast and furious. It was hourly. It was at least 3 times a day. As you start to understand what type of investigation you're in, what stage of that investigation you're in, what is the timeline for when you're expected to respond, how long it may take for you to gather documents in discovery, when you may be expecting a subpoena, and when you may be expected to testify. All those things will dictate then what the cadence is. But in our instance, as in many crises, you're usually on the phone multiple times a day in the first instance, and then you get into a more regular cadence, which could be every morning, it could be every other day, it could be whatever it might be, depending on sort of the level of crisis that you're in at that stage.
So when I was at Justice, it was always interesting when you're sending out the subpoenas or you're in private practice and you receive something from the Justice Department, whether the criminal or civil division, and you watch on C-SPAN some of these investigations, and it's really interesting. When I worked for Phil during the committee time of really working with a number of members. You're a member, and different people on your side were fantastic, and obviously the people that the chairman was fantastic on our side. But it was really interesting to understand and really think about what's going through a member's mind as they're sort of sending out or issuing, and then what's actually going through a staff director or a staff person's mind. So I think that'd be really interesting. You know, I have a few thoughts, but it'd be interesting to hear, Susanne, from you, from your experience.
Sure. So, a traditional congressional investigation starts with a document request. It starts with like a real plan, right? I'm going to investigate into this issue. We did like a very large drug pricing investigation. We're going to send out a bunch of letters. We're going to ask for a lot of documents to a lot of companies. We're going to investigate and really learn about an issue. We're going to get in those documents. We're going to study them. And then we're going to plan a series of reports and hearings that come out of that, right? And that would be, from a member and a staff perspective, something that is really pre-planned and sort of sat and discussed together ahead of time and about the member's priorities. And so really when you're looking at a member, they're thinking at the beginning of a Congress about a list of priorities that they have, that they want to move forward legislation or reform, regulatory reform or other kind of policy reforms. And then they want to build an investigation and a set of hearings that will then move forward the policies that they are trying to advocate for. So finding the facts in order to move forward the policy. And so that's a sort of very traditional one. However, you know, members are reading the news every day, so are staff, and they're reacting to it. They're also reacting to calls from constituents, calls from a number of other people. They're on TV, they get asked a question. And so those are other areas to keep an eye out for, because members will hear about a problem and then they will inevitably want to solve that problem. Because that's what they want to do, right? So that also will spark a congressional investigation. It'll spark a series of things that have to sort of then get dealt with. So anyway, that's sort of from a member and a staff perspective.
Phil, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I just remember when I was a staff director at Judiciary Committee, Chairman Sensenbrenner asked me to go around and meet with all the members, minority and majority, on what would they like to get out of the Judiciary Committee. And Chairman Sensenbrenner was a big oversight person. He had a staff person on each subcommittee just to focus on oversight. So I went around and I figured out what the members wanted to do on oversight, and then that sort of managed, and then we try to do that for an oversight plan for that Congress. And I'm sure other committees do the same thing, especially OGR, because they're a big oversight committee. But that's sort of why a lot of times how oversight is conducted on a committee, it's sort of depending upon on the chair and the members. What do they want to focus on? Do they want to focus on legislation, which you need oversight to tee that up, or do they want to do oversight, you know, just fraud, waste, and abuse stuff? They read newspaper articles, like you were saying, and those kind of things. So that's, and now I think there is requirements to do oversight. Each chair is supposed to have an oversight plan at the beginning of the Congress and then at the end of the Congress, and they're supposed to submit what they did. It's a committee report on legislation and oversight. So there is a formal process, too, for oversight.
And side note, that formal process is not a secret. It is an actual written out collection of planned oversight things that each committee in Congress puts together. They submit them all to the oversight committee, and then the oversight committee publishes them all together. And so it is that sort of planned out ahead of time process is not a secret, and you can find out from that, and those of us working in this field sort of already know what are the things on each committee's sort of list of to-dos. It doesn't mean that when the news story hits and there's a consumer protection issue or a problem in the news or a new, you know, emergency crisis, that they're not going to jump on that. They're obviously always going to jump on that. But the sort of pre-planned out stuff you can find out about.
Yeah, and I would just say that on a large corporation, you know, where they have diverse interests and stuff, they should take a look at those, because there might be some nuggets in there that could affect them. Not that they have to go crazy and get started on something, but they should it should ring a bell.
You know, Phil, you had mentioned about taking any type of inquiry or anything very seriously, and most companies, individuals do. I think it sort of goes back to sort of that CCA that I was talking about, showing concern, which the concern is just reaching out, just the initial reach out. When I was on the Senate or on the House side, just knowing that, hey, what I'm doing is very important. That is that first step, that connection. Also, I guess I would say a little bit of the difference between a member and a staff member. Whether it's outside counsel or you have a GA, government affairs, is when you're meeting with staff. I think that's having a high EQ of going onto the Hill and meeting with staff. I always talk to my clients, it's important to show that you may not be thinking you're meeting with the member, but you're meeting with staff. And staff, when it comes to an investigation and what they're handling, is just important. How do you, it's a hard thing to sort of talk about or to put my hands around, but what do you think about sort of that dynamic, that emotional dynamic of when you're engaging with staff?
Yeah, I think these are always going to be really individualized analyses, because it really does make a difference which staff you're engaging with and where you're at and what they're thinking about in terms of your client, right? I mean, there are lots of opportunities in lots of different places to get out of being investigated if you can explain why you were just the wrong person. Because, sometimes somebody just read a news story and you are actually not the right person. And so, there are great opportunities for that. And there are also really good opportunities for showing that you're really trying to be compliant, and then getting into a negotiation where you really get the things that you really most needed for your client. You needed more time. You needed to protect certain sets of documents that are really critical to protect. And they didn't really need those things. Or you need to protect attorney-client privilege, right? That's another area which could be of deep sensitivity to your client, not only for this prospect, but for all of the other ongoing litigation that they're doing. And, if you come up to a congressional investigator and you just ask them, do you recognize privilege? The response you will get is, no, Congress does not recognize attorney-client privilege. But in truth, it's really quite more nuanced. There is plenty of room for negotiation, because they also are not desperately looking, in most cases, to breach that privilege. Their lawyers also, and they have a respect for it, and there's no need for it. And so the discussion then becomes a negotiation about how do we ensure that we can keep our privileged materials that we really need to keep privilege, and only have Congress breaching those kinds of things when they're literally investigating something that was a discussion between the attorney and the client, like they think there's a fraud or some activity involved there.
As someone smarter than me said, everything's negotiable except the truth, and this plays in the situation very well. And to your initial question about showing concern, in our instance, we did receive the letter within 2 days. Myself and another very senior person at our company were on Capitol Hill, seeing as many of the members as possible now, and their staffs. Now, some may say this is an investigation. We're not going to see you, but that's okay. We showed that we were concerned. We showed that we wanted to learn more, and we brought the right level of executive to those kind of conversations. We didn't just bring some lower level lackey and say, oh yeah, they'll figure it out. That sends a different signal to members of Congress and staff. So I think showing that urgency and showing that concern is important in the process.
And I just remember when I was at one of the agencies that I used to work for, we used to get these, we received a lot of subpoenas from the Energy and Commerce Committee when Chairman Dingell was the chair. We used to call them Dingell-grams. And I remember being in a discussion with I think somebody from the solicitor's office, and I was reviewing what was going to be going to the Hill, and they almost like they led off with this is attorney-client privilege, and I said, no, we're not going to lead off with attorney-client privilege, because he does not recognize that, nor does any other chair of a committee recognize it. But you have to dip into it a little carefully, and you may end up getting there when you can make the argument that this is really bad, you don't need to do this, and all that kind of stuff. But and then there's all those other kinds of nuances too. But I do remember that one specifically.
Well, Thanks so much for that, Phil. And as you know, I really appreciate your friendship over the years and having worked with you. And I think a lot of people know you've worked on both sides of the aisle and you've got along. You've taught me the ability to sort of work on both sides of the aisle and working through issues. But in terms of both sides of the aisle, can you tell us a little bit more about, is there a difference between the majority and minority when it comes to oversight? Can you sort of talk about that, please?
Well, I think that there is a difference. The chair and the majority, they're the ones that are elected by their own caucus or conference to be on the committee initially, internally, and then there's a House resolution that is passed to elect the chairs and then to elect the members of the committee. So there is a difference between the majority and the minority with regards to oversight. I mean, it's the chair that manages a committee. It's the chair that runs the committee. The chair has the relationships with the leadership, and the chair is considered, at least among the majority party, the leader of those groups of the individual members, and they have to go to that person to try to get their agenda. But it's not like the minority is without anything. Once an investigation is approved, or the minority can try to go and work together on trying to have something bipartisan, or maybe they've thought of something that somebody else hasn't. They can go to the member, the chair, and get that approved. And so that is, it does matter. But once an investigation is approved or an oversight letter is approved, sometimes it's signed by both the majority and the minority, then it kicks in that the staff and the members, whether it's a hearing or a deposition, they have the authority to ask questions just like everybody else. They have authority both, whether it's a deposition or whether a hearing, they have the authority to ask written questions for the record and all those other kind of things. But it does matter.
And there's a whole other dynamic of a minority-led investigation where the chair and the majority does not join, and we obviously did a lot of those under Ranking Member Elijah Cummings. And in those investigations, the minority never has a subpoena power authority. What they have is the power of the media, right? The power of the public attention that they can bring to a particular issue. And then it really matters who is the member leading that and how much public attention they can bring. And obviously some senators, some members have more ability in that area than others. And there are some agencies who provide documents in response to that, and these are not things to sort of ignore. They're things to think about strategically and consider really seriously on an individualized perspective. Because a ranking member now could become a chairman later, and they don't forget what they were interested in before. But also, a ranking member could start an investigation and then pitch it over either to the chair of their committee, their own committee, or across the aisle, right? Across to the Senate or across to the House, if there's a chair of the opposite, of the same party who's in the majority on the other side. And so there can be sort of bicameral investigations also where you can kind of get some additional power. And then also in the minority, one of the things that we like to do a lot was just combine together, because of course, if you got a letter from 5 ranking members, it was going to have more attention and more power, and you were going to sort of see the attention you were going to get. And then also from the perspective of going to a hearing, perhaps your company shows up at hearings all the time to talk about any variety of things, often things where you wanted to be at the hearing talking about it, but you need to be considering who are all the members who are going to come to that hearing, because there could be somebody who sent you a letter who's on the minority side, and they're coming to that hearing, and they are going to come with their agenda, with their questions, and they're going to ask you those questions from that letter. So you just have to keep being aware of all of those kind of perspectives.
Oh, that's right. No, thank you, Susanne. I think all of us have been watching a lot of sort of the antitrust issues and the tech companies and the CEOs testifying, in the House financial and the banking industry. I remember representing one or two CEOs in front of like Intel committees and having to prepare them. But, Charlie, what is it? What is it like when, a CEO has to go and testify? Can you talk to us a little bit more about what is that prep like? How do you prepare someone that's an executive that's not maybe in the Beltway and that's flying in? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. First of all, need to take it seriously, need to find that right tone of what's, everything's negotiable but the truth, so stay truthful, but at the same time not sound arrogant, be humble, be responsive. It's a very fine needle to thread in working with a CEO who may not be accustomed to having being put in a position where there are pretty difficult questions being posed, where they are being filmed, and this will be snippeted out in ways that may be unflattering to them at the time. And so preparing them for not only the testimony itself, but the follow-up that comes from that, because following before, sometimes, and following the testimony before Congress, the CEO can speak to the media. They can speak to other outlets to get their story out. But when they're within the confines of a committee or subcommittee hearing, they have to narrowly thread the needle of not sounding too arrogant, staying humble, but staying true to the business that they represent. And so, as always with lawyers, it depends on the CEO or the senior executive you represent, of how savvy they are to that, how ready they are for that sort of spotlight, which most times is unflattering. There's rarely an opportunity where you're being called in this situation where you're going to be flattered and thanked. It's a very difficult seat to be in, and so preparing them for that, making sure they're prepared and over-prepared, and thinking through all the different members and their pet issues that they may be bringing up that may have really only tangential relation to the investigation that you've been called to, and allow them not to react in a certain way, but to respond thoughtfully to whatever those questions may be, whether those are, whether they think they're relevant or not. That's the trick of preparing a CEO.
I would say on that, as well as, and I've been involved in a couple of these as other people have, we always would try to get the CEO or the significant witness to do a murder board where somebody else is acting like members, and they try to act like the members will act at the hearing based upon their personalities, and really just grind it out. And not in a negative way, but just so you're not seeing this kind of reaction or these kind of questions for the first time when you're sitting there.
I agree. And as you know, nothing beats preparation, and nobody is really good the first time, even if they're really exceptionally great at everything else, obviously. And it's also really important when you're trying to keep that measured tone to remember in the back of your head that somebody else can deal with the kind of press strategy response, that kind of rapid response that you feel like you want to, right? You feel that you want to react to. Someone else can deal with that in a way that doesn't make you look not great. So you can still keep that above the board, really great tone, and have a press strategy really behind the scenes that's addressing the kind of nuanced of the wrongfulness of the question or the unfairness or whatever the case may be.
And it's hard in today's era. There are many CEOs and senior executives who do have personalities, who like to be in the spotlight, And in this instance, being boring and not very memorable is actually a better way to go. And it is hard sometimes with some of the personalities to have them tone it down.
Now, I think it's critically important. When I worked for a United States Senator, we always talked about advance work. And so I think, having a good team to lay the foundation, and like Phil was saying, to be able to come back and then do the murder board. But you've got to lay the foundation. You've got to do the groundwork. You just don't show up. You've got to do the groundwork. You've got to meet with Susanne. You got to meet with Phil. You got to talk it through. You go back, do the murder board. And then, yes, I agree. I think in terms of humility, getting in and getting out, and always telling the truth. So
I can't say, though, that in some instances, the team may say it's appropriate to get a little confrontational, depending upon what the accusation is, and somebody has to draw the line in the sand. And I would say you can be firm, you don't have to go over the top, but you may have to say, that is not true. I know that you're incorrect. And so it's not, you don't do preparation just so you're going to be weak and just sitting there, taking all the punches. It's basically you want to be prepared, but you want to know when you're going to draw the line and when you're not.
absolutely.
That's a fair point. And of course, there are only 5-minute rounds. And so,
That's true.
that is a very particularized way of both asking questions and answering them. And you have to kind of keep that timing in mind when you're working on it.
And many instances, we're able to tell our story in the written testimony that is submitted at the outset, or that might be verbalized by the CEO at the outset. But and that gives the CEO the ability, or the senior executive the ability, to tell their side of the story at the outset, and then sit back and respond. And I agree, not respond and take it. Know when you're going to draw the line, but have that organized with your outside law firm, with your comms team, and know that that's going to be a flashpoint.
That's right. No, there is a vacuum. There's always a vacuum. And Phil, when I worked with you, it was, if you're not filling the vacuum, somebody else is. So you're right. I think you've got to get your story out. The story aligns with the truth. Sometimes things are sideways, not due to the actual facts. It's just the way maybe the media is looking at it. So I agree with that. Here we've sort of talked about, this practice group. I've got a great number of colleagues, former state AG, former SEC, former U.S. attorney down in North Carolina. So I've got a great team here, and people on the team of the crisis management and Congressional Investigations. Susanne, I can talk all day why we sort of thought about this nexus, but I'd love to get your thoughts in terms of, why is it with Congressional Investigations there is a nexus between crisis management and Congressional Investigations?
Sure. Well, as you know, Congress doesn't act in a vacuum. Congress acts and reacts to everything that is going on out there. And so almost always, when you're dealing with something that Congress is interested in, it is something that someone else is also interested in. There is almost always some parallel investigation. It could be civil litigation, it could be criminal, we could be dealing with state AGs, we could be dealing with regulators who are looking at different things. You name it, it's out there. And there's also usually some level of press interest, and really already some level of sort of interest and excitement in the space. And so I'm sure in your practice, you also really think that it's important to, think across the lines of all of these areas. Each one of them feeds each other. And when they happen in parallel, you can't consider any one of them. And that includes the public relations aspect, right? The communications publicly, however you're doing them, in whatever context you're doing them, they all need to have an integrated strategy where, there isn't one thing that's working on its own. There can be priorities, right? Obviously, we've both been prosecutors, and a criminal prosecution is a priority. But even with those priorities, you need to be considering and sort of looking strategically down the line at how each thing is going to feed each other. Because, of course, a news story can spark a congressional investigation, can spark a regulator's interest. A regulator's interest can spark can spark a congressional investigation, can spark a news story, and they all feed back and forth to each other. And there's been so many instances where I've seen a congressional investigation sort of collect documents and then put them out, and then those documents be used in some other entity, either by a regulator or in civil litigation, et cetera. So these are really things to be kind of thinking about and working through strategically as a team at the very outset.
And going back to that concept of team, making sure that team isn't too narrow,
Yeah.
and adding those people. In our instance, one of the things we didn't think of was we were thinking through, okay, how do we deal on the government affairs side? How do we deal on the press side? How do we deal on the legal side? What about customers and getting your sales team? What are they going to be saying, in our instance, to Walmart or Costco immediately about this? What are the talking points they need? And so you have to think about that team pretty broadly and make sure that it's running in a coordinated fashion. But it's usually more than a narrow subset of folks.
Well, this is always sort of an interesting question to ask, and we want this to be an interesting segment. So a little bit of sort of forecasting and thinking about where things are headed. And I can't think of anybody better than Phil and Susanne to sort of give us their thoughts on sort of 2021, 2022. Where do you see things going, Phil?
Well, I would say that there's obviously a lot of issues, big issues out there right now that have been sort of teed up or people have talked about. I would say right now the voting rights is a big issue, where there's oversight being done on the states. There's legislation, and I would say that oversight is going to continue. I would say that there has been a select committee on the insurrection, and I think that they're going to start their hearings in a couple of weeks, and I think that's going to go on for a while, and I think it'll be very broad, and they're going to get into a lot of different aspects of what happened and why it happened and who was responsible for it and all that other kind of stuff. So I think that that kind of hearing can metastasize into a lot of different things once people start looking at it. There's been a lot of groundwork already laid by both the House and the Senate, but now it's they're going to have the select committee, and we're all familiar with select committees, and they have a focus and they have a time frame. And so when you ever have that, it's sort of a hurry up. We're not going to be here forever. This can't go into the next Congress, or maybe it could, but I think there's a lot of people that want to get this moving, and I think it's going to be quick and broad. And I don't know. I would just say there'll be oversight over the energy industry. You know what I mean, on the issues dealing with global climate change. There's been stuff comes up about some of the oil companies that have said things about energy issues and stuff like that are not too flattering, sort of like what happened when the tobacco industry, they found some internal documents. So I have a feeling that those things are going to be teed up. There'll be oversight, but there's finance, banks, I mean, issues relating to minorities, how they've been treated by banks, how they've been treated, all those kind of things I think are going to permeate throughout the oversight.
Yeah, I agree with all of those. I think, when you're thinking about where oversight is going, you should think about a couple different categories. So one of them is sort of the general waste, fraud, and abuse category, because that's always a traditional place for oversight, whether it's being done by Democrats or Republicans. And so, that would be COVID funds, right? COVID relief funds, which I'm sure you've done already work on. And that's oversight, obviously, from a congressional side. There's still a select subcommittee on coronavirus issues, but also, throughout IGs and a number of other regulators are looking at those. And then, other COVID-related funds that are also going out, and other sort of government programs giving out funds, either grants or loans, are always something to be looking at. Department of Defense is always a good kind of direction for those. As a second category, there's always apparently now a bipartisan interest in the tech industry. So there will always be, and from every different angle, whether we're looking at privacy or regulations or antitrust issues, you name it, we're going to be looking at the tech industry, I think, extensively in the future. And then the third category is just right now, because of course Democrats are in control, Democratic priorities to move change, which, as you said, energy. I think solar also, like not solar, clean energy also, like solar and others, will be kind of in the direction of both getting that attention now and maybe getting that attention if Republicans take over the Congress, as well as consumer protection issues are always really hot, and you know, those kinds of things.
I was just going to say that one thing you shouldn't overlook on congressional investigations is the role of the IGs, who have a dual reporting relationship both to the agency and to the Congress, and it was written in statute that way. They're used a lot to supplement what the staff can do. And then you have the General Accounting Office as well, that, you know, they're really involved in obviously the COVID stuff, almost to the fact they're overwhelmed. But those are two agencies that sometimes, at least when I was on the committee staff, I would try to go to them first to get started on something that was deep and we didn't have the capacity, and then to bring stuff back and then to try to manage that investigation. So if some of your companies get inquiries from them, you might as well just consider it as being either executive branch, Congress, or both.
And I would say from a business perspective, it's always looking at it in its broadest terms. So you can say, well, you know, Congress is only going to focus on big tech, and that's where all the data privacy issues are. But data, everybody's collecting data these days, no matter what your business is. And so you're going to have to look at that lens of, could we be subject to this, or what could the, you know, issues be, you know, if an oversight investigation is launched, and, you know, it might not be you initially, but you could be drawn into it as well.
Well, Charlie, I think you're right. I was thinking about 3 years, just cybersecurity and privacy. You know, we've seen a lot with sort of the ransomware, you know, cryptocurrency. You know, those are going to be in areas. I think environmental justice. Mm-hmm. You know, I think one thing we'll talk a little bit about is, which are concerned with boards, is sort of the ESG. You know, mm-hmm. and what issues, you know, greenwashing. What are some of the issues that boards have to deal with in terms of ESG? I can see them looking into that. And then, like Phil, you talked a little bit about sort of, you know, equal justice issues, and how in the banking space, how is that being played out? I think this administration really cares and really thinking about that. So, okay, well, this has been a wonderful time, but before we end, I want to just touch on something that we all have sort of been talking about off camera, and I think it's an imperative right now, and it's always been imperative, and that's DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And some people may ask, you know, crisis management and DEI, or congressional investigations and DEI, and I think we say absolutely. I think it is DEI is a business imperative, but also I'd like to sort of think about it as a leadership imperative. And I've seen a number of companies, a number of CEOs, a number of general counsels really make it an imperative. I'm involved in the Minority Corporate Counsel Association, and they've helped us sort of fill up the pipeline. I know Cadwalader is committed to diversity, equity, inclusion, and I just wanted to just pause real quick and really just sort of get your thoughts on what's going on. We talked about what's going on in Congress, but I think there's an overlap here, and I'll start with you, Susanne.
Sure. Well, as you know, I worked for 10 years with the honor and the privilege of being able to work for Chairman Elijah Cummings, who was deeply influential in my life, and obviously believed very strongly in advocating for opportunities and really engaging in this space, and growing what we had as a staff, which was a really diverse staff that was able to really grow and strategically benefit and truly valued the diversity that we had, not just diversity of race and gender, but also a diversity of lived experience, right? What kinds of schools you went to, what kinds of experiences you've come from, what kind of skill sets that you have. And we saw extensively that because we had that, we were able to really represent the American public and see around the corners to where the issues were coming up and going to be relevant to the constituents that Elijah Cummings had and all of the other members had. And so, we have thought about for many years this DE&I space as being a really critical element. It's also a really critical element now for recruiting. For me, when I left the Hill, I was looking to go to a place that really valued it and went to a law firm with the majority of the partners are women. And is extremely sort of heavy in the LGBTQ space. And that was a great value to me. I was looking for something like that and have found that in the sort of law firm space, as you know, at Cadwalader, it really attracts the best talent when you're able to reflect that talent back to them. And so, I think as we're talking about this space and really working within it, sort of arming up teams of attorneys working on a particular case, for example, who are able to have that diversity of experience as well as all of the other things is really helpful strategically to be able to sort of really benefit your client to the best.
That's right. No, I think that's right, Susanne. And I had the honor of spending time and meeting Chairman Cummings, and he was an inspiration to me and his commitment. But also, I worked with Chairman Gowdy and his commitment. I believe he even wrote a book, with Senator Tim Scott about their relationship in terms of diversity. And Phil, you were the staff director, and if I could say, I mean, the team that you and the chairman had put together was very diverse, not only just in race, and gender, and thought. And so you've been a real leader in that area. Phil, any thoughts that you have?
Well, I would just say that I was sensitized to this issue very young in my career. I was the minority counsel on the Civil and Constitutional Rights Subcommittee under Congressman Don Edwards. We reauthorized the Voting Rights Act in 1982. And I was working for Congressman Sensenbrenner then at the time in the minority, and then 25 years later we reauthorized the Voting Rights Act. I've been involved in handicapped discrimination and ADA, and I've always, and also in some of the positions I've had, I sort of teeing up a little bit off of what Susanne was saying, I like to have diverse talent from all across the country. I don't think that a particular, the best law schools, I would like to have diversity because they represent geographical diversity.
That's great, Phil. Charlie?
So in the business community, your customers are extremely diverse, and so it would not make great business sense if you also were not diverse and you did not include a diverse group that adds to the marketplace of ideas for how do you move your business forward for your consumers and customers who are who you're trying to advance your business with. And so it makes complete business sense to have a DEI strategy and to lead on this issue going forward. I think bringing it back into the context of a crisis, what I could say is, if you're thinking about an issue like this when a crisis hits, you're too late. And so there have been businesses who get hit with EEOC investigations, that get hit with civil rights complaints, and if they haven't worked through this issue at the time they've gotten that on their plate, they're too late. So for businesses that are thinking about getting into this space, it's always a good time to get into it and move and progress it forward. So I really appreciate you bringing that to our attention at this setting.
Thanks, Charlie. As you were talking, I I think about sort of the concept that we use in compliance as tone from the top. And, I think everyone here of the different leaders, and we've been leaders, and really just setting the right tone. And it's nobody gets it perfect, but I think the more we try in many different ways, I think the better things become. And so once again, I really appreciate everyone's time. Charlie, Phil, I know Phil, you've left the Hill and started, I think, Kiko Strategies, which you're doing a great job there. And Susanne, your friendship has always been fantastic. I think what I'd like to do is just give you all just a little bit, if you have any remaining thoughts for the audience, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure. I'd just like to say thank you to this group. It's been a great conversation. Thank you to Cadwalader for hosting.
Yeah, I would like to follow up on that, and we're far afield, Mark, from where we used to have these conversations in my office that were very intense. And Susanne, you always kept us on our toes. You had a masterful response to things that we did, but we tried to work things out when we were on different sides of the aisle through rules and process and those kind of things. So it's nice to have both of you on the panel here today, and it was really nice to have an acquaintance with you and to learn about your background and also the other end of congressional compliance. So thank you.
Yeah, it was great to meet you, and always fantastic to see you, Phil. I'm not sure that I anticipated years ago that we would sit on a panel together and agree on so many different things. And thank you so much, Mark, for bringing us all to the table and hosting this event, and to Cadwalader. I think this is a really interesting and important conversation. And I love the way that you have integrated DE&I into it, as I think that your leadership in these spaces, having been both a prosecutor and in the Congressional Investigation space, is going to be really helpful to clients.
Well, I just want to say thanks again to everyone that tuned in, and once again, many thanks to my colleagues here at Cadwalader. It's a great team, and thanks to Pat Quinn for his commitment and his leadership. All right, everyone, thank you so much, and have a good evening.